Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news. UFC President Dana White announced two more massive fights for UFC 296. We are getting Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and we are also getting Tony Ferguson versus Paddy Pimblett. I'm going to give you my reaction and early prediction for both these fights. And I feel like going into both these fights, a lot of people are thinking there may be the end of the career for two of these fighters, but I don't necessarily think they realized it could not be the two fighters that you actually think. There may be two funerals at UFC 296, but it may not be the ones you're actually thinking of when you first see these two matchups. But we'll discuss that later in the video. But UFC 296 is looking stacked. The main event is Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington for the welterweight title. The co-main event is Alexandre Pantoja versus Brandon Royval 2 for the flyweight title. And now you add these two fights to it. This is a stacked card. I've already done multiple videos on the main and co-main event. I'll link them down in the description if you want to go check them out after this. But let's start off with the welterweight matchup. We have Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Wonderboy Thompson has vacated the PMF title, and somebody else may have already picked it up, but we'll discuss that later in the video. He has vacated that belt, and now he is fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov. And this is exactly what I thought would happen. I called this a couple weeks ago in a video where I discussed why the UFC should cut Wonderboy Thompson, because I knew. You go back to UFC 291 in July, Wonderboy Thompson was scheduled to fight Michel Pereira. Michel Pereira missed weight. Wonderboy Thompson turned it down. He said, I'm not fighting him. Now, I don't necessarily blame him for that, but the problem was Wonderboy Thompson was already asking the UFC for favorable matchups, and they accommodated him with Kevin Holland, an unranked striker, back in December of 2022. And then they accommodated him with Michel Pereira, a striker ranked number 15 in the division. Meanwhile, you have Wonderboy Thompson ranked in the top 10, turning down fights, saying, I don't want to fight any grapplers. If you wrestled in elementary school, Wonderboy was not willing to fight you. But once Wonderboy turned down that fight with Michel Pereira, I knew that Dana White and the UFC were pissed. And I knew that's why they did not pay Wonderboy Thompson, because they expected him to take that fight, because they've been doing him favors for the past year or so, saying, okay, Wonderboy, you only want fun fights for here on out? Okay, we'll give you some fun fights. And then Wonderboy kind of takes advantage of that kindness and says, oh, well, you know what? I'm not going to fight him. I want to just collect my paycheck, even though I'm not going to fight, because Michel Pereira missed weight. And I knew, and I discussed this in a video, I said, for now on, all the UFC is going to offer Wonderboy Thompson is Shavkat Rakhmonov, or maybe somebody like Rinat Fakhretdinov. All they were going to do, Dana White, the UFC, was going to be vindictive and offer Wonderboy unfavorable matchups. And they were going to say, take it or leave it. Because if you turn down the fight, your contract is automatically extended. And I think, truly, and I know a lot of people are going to give Wonderboy credit, and credit to Wonderboy for taking this fight, but I'm going to be honest. I think Wonderboy was forced into taking this fight. I think the UFC said, take it or leave it. We're just going to keep offering you this fight. If you don't like this fight, we're just going to offer you another fight like Rinat Fakhretdinov. We need a fight for Shavkat Rakhmonov. This is a fight where Shavkat's ranked ahead of you. You say you want to move towards a title. Well, here's an opportunity, because if you beat Shavkat, you become in title contention. A win over Kevin Holland, who just lost to JDM, hasn't aged that well, and it's not moving you closer to a title. At the time, Kevin Holland was unranked in the welterweight division. If you beat Shavkat, if he beats Shavkat Rakhmonov, he is in title contention. He's won 2 fights away after a win over Shavkat from title contention, and that's what he claims he wants. And I know he was hoping and praying the UFC would give him Kamaru Usman, because he was looking at Kamaru Usman like that meme where the guy's behind the tree rubbing his hands, and he's thinking, Kamaru Usman's getting up in age. His wrestling hasn't looked that great in the last few fights, and he's coming off 2 straight losses, one by brutal KO, and he's slowing down. I think Wonderboy was really hoping to get Kamaru Usman. He thought that was a winnable fight for him. I think he would have lost anyway. And then he was going to say, well, I'm the #1 contender. I beat a former champion who's sitting at #1 in the rankings. I'm the #1 contender now. But instead, the UFC said, no. You're fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov, or you're fighting nobody, because they also offered him Ian Gary, which supposedly he turned down. Now, Dana wasn't really clear if that was kind of short notice or what, but I think it was short notice. So I don't necessarily blame Wonderboy for turning that down as well. But I think the UFC was pissed at Wonderboy, and I think they were hell-bent on booking him versus Shavkat Rakhmonov, because Wonderboy had already shown that he had no interest in that fight. But now that the fight is actually announced and now that the fight is actually official and hopefully they both make it to UFC 296 unscathed, I love this matchup. I absolutely, positively love this matchup because Shavkat Rakhmonov has kind of been the boogeyman of the welterweight division, and we want to see him tested on his way up the ladder. A lot of people, myself included, have looked at Shavkat and said, oh, he's a future champion. You know, he has 17 wins, 0 losses. All 17 wins are via finish. He's coming off a finish win over Jeff Neal. Shavkat looks like a future champion. And a lot of people think Shavkat's one fight away from a potential title shot, depending on how the division plays out. And he hasn't really been thoroughly tested. He fought Jeff Neal. That was a great test for him. But that's really the toughest test of his career at this point. And I think Wonderboy is the next evolution kind of in the, or in the forward movement of Shavkat Rakhmonov in his career, because Wonderboy is still an elite striker. I know a lot of people think, oh, you hate Wonderboy, this and that. No, I just hate that the welterweight division, nobody seems to want to accept any fights and everyone wants to sit on the sidelines except Belal Muhammad and Shavkat Rakhmonov. But I'm happy this fight is happening. Wonderboy Thompson's a good test for Shavkat. I think Wonderboy Thompson could win this fight. I'm not picking him to win this fight by any means, but I think Wonderboy could win this fight. If he can use his footwork, I think he could outstrike Shavkat. It's just Shavkat's so relentless moving forward. He does have offensive wrestling. He has excellent jiu-jitsu. He has nasty power, and he has a great variety of attacks. I mean, spinning back kicks to the body, spinning heel kicks upstairs. He has nasty combinations. I mean, Shavkat is so well-rounded. So for my early prediction, I have to go Shavkat Rakhmonov. Wonderboy Thompson's getting up there in age. He's in his 40s. I just don't see a scenario where 40-year-old Wonderboy Thompson goes out there and like beats the brakes off of Shavkat Rakhmonov. There's a big difference between fighting somebody like Kevin Holland and fighting someone like Shavkat Rakhmonov. So for my early prediction, I'm going to go Shavkat by finish. I think Shavkat probably finishes Wonderboy. I'm going to say Shavkat, honestly, by TKO. I could see him getting a submission. I could also see Shavkat just winning a decision because Wonderboy is pretty durable. I mean, he's been knocked out one time in his career, and it's against Anthony Pettis, and it was kind of, I don't want to say fluky, but basically it was kind of fluky. It was a Superman punch from Anthony Pettis. But it's not like Wonderboy is a dead body. It's not like Wonderboy has no chin. I just think Shavkat has too many tools, and I think he gets it done against Wonderboy. But don't be surprised if Wonderboy puts up a very valiant effort in this fight. You know, Wonderboy's going to be training takedown defense nonstop. He might even buy himself a wrestling singlet. And I think he's going to be worried about the takedowns, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be Shavkat's 100% game plan just to go out there and grapple. Shavkat's just a well-rounded fighter. He's not like a Khabib Nurmagomedov. You know, he's not one of these guys that just nonstop relentless wrestle like Colby Covington or Merab Dvalishvili or any of those guys who are just natural wrestlers. Shavkat can do it all, and that's what makes him such an exciting contender in the division. But ultimately, I love this fight, and ultimately, this answers another question about the welterweight division because I wondered if there would be a backup for UFC 296. Now, I do think the UFC could have Shavkat as a backup, but I feel like if Leon pulls out or if Colby pulls out, I don't think Leon or Colby is going to want to take Shavkat Rakhmonov on short notice. So I'm wondering if they're going to have Belal Muhammad on standby, because also the UFC, it seems like they have a history now of having the backup not even fight on the card. They just have the backup weigh in. They don't fight on the card, and they're just ready to go in case of emergency. And both guys fighting already know who the backup is. So I'm wondering if Belal Muhammad is actually going to get his title shot. I think he might be the backup for UFC 296. He's probably not going to fight on this card. You'll have the winner of Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington fight Belal Muhammad in 2024. And then the winner, if it's, or not really the winner, if it's Shavkat Rakhmonov who beats Wonderboy, they will be next in line for the winner of the main event of 296 versus Belal Muhammad. Shavkat Rakhmonov will fight for the title after that. I 100% believe if Shavkat beats Wonderboy, he is going to fight for the title next. Now, if Wonderboy wins, I think he's got to win at least one more fight before he fights for the welterweight title, because you look at his recent resume, you know, he's lost 2 out of his last 3. He lost to Belal Muhammad, lost to Gilbert Burns. He only has a win over Kevin Holland, who was unranked at the time. So I love this fight. I'm happy that Wonderboy finally took it. I'm happy that Wonderboy finally caved. Maybe it was the pressure. I put the pressure on Wonderboy Thompson. I said, look, this guy doesn't want to fight. Cut him from the organization. Send him to PFL. Send him to Bellator. He's finally taking a fight. But to be honest, I don't think he had any option. I don't think the UFC was willing to let Wonderboy just, oh, here's another favorable matchup for you after everything we've done for you and you've kind of turned down fights left and right. I don't think the UFC was going to be willing to give him another favorable matchup while he's ranked in the top 10 of the welterweight division. Okay, let's move on to the next fight that was announced, and that is Tony Ferguson versus Paddy Pimblett. The dead body of Tony Ferguson. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Being a fan of Tony Ferguson, I feel like I've created my own prison, you know? I feel like being a fan of Tony Ferguson, when I heard this fight announcement, I don't even smoke, and I just wanted to light up a cigarette and listen to a Creed CD. That's how I felt hearing this announcement, because the young in this sport perpetually eat the old. And Tony's on a 6-fight losing streak. A 6-fight losing streak. He's been finished in his last 3. And he's been dominated in all 6 of those losses. Justin Gaethje took his soul. Charles Oliveira took his soul. Beneil Dariush just beat him up and controlled him and dominated him. Michael Chandler took his soul even worse than everyone else. Then you have the loss to Nate Diaz on short notice. You have the loss to Bobby Green, where he got submitted at UFC 291. And now you have Tony, who used to be the boogeyman of the division. He's 40 years old, and he's taking on Paddy Pimblett. I know the sport, the UFC likes to build up contenders. They like to build up names. Paddy Pimblett's popular. But Paddy Pimblett, we're really going to feed Tony Ferguson to Paddy Pimblett. Does the UFC and Paddy really think a win over Tony Ferguson is going to take him higher in the rankings? I mean, does that get Paddy Pimblett a ranking? I don't think so. And honestly, I think Paddy Pimblett has already picked up the PMF title, because Paddy Pimblett turned down Matt Frevola. Matt Frevola has been begging for that fight left and right. It seemed like Paddy accepted it online. Matt Frevola was adamant, that is the fight I want. And now it's not happening. Matt Frevola is taking on Benoit Saint Denis, which is an absolute banger. But I think Paddy Pimblett didn't want that fight. I really don't think he wanted that fight at all, because he would get starched. So instead, they're going to take Paddy Pimblett, who is undefeated in the UFC, but he lost to Jarrett Gordon in his last fight and got a robbery win. And they're just going to feed him to the dead body of Tony Ferguson. I really hate to see it. I really hate to see it. I do, you know. Tony Ferguson is literally he's just hanging over the edge of his grave. And maybe he's thinking, you know, 6 feet ain't so far down. But I feel like there's a real chance that Paddy Pimblett here absolutely bodies Tony Ferguson. Now, I'm not saying that's my early prediction. We're going to get to that in a second. But I really think that Tony, I mean, he's brain dead. He has so much CT. He's crazy. And I just don't know, even Paddy Pimblett, who I don't think is that good, who I think is bottom of the barrel UFC caliber, I just don't know if I trusted Tony Ferguson, who's on a 6-fight losing streak, and he's been dominated in almost all 6 of those fights. He had a competitive fight with, you know, Bobby Green. He looked good in the first round. He had a competitive fight with Michael Chandler, to be fair enough, but that's before he got his head punted off. I just don't know if I trust Tony to be able to get it done. I really don't. And I'm telling you right now, Tony taking the Paddy Pimblett fight, he must be thinking, you know, this is my sacrifice to the UFC. Because a win over Tony Ferguson, I know he's on a 6-fight losing streak, but they'll hype that up. They'll say, oh, Paddy Pimblett beat a former interim UFC champion in Tony Ferguson. If the UFC builds Paddy Pimblett's name off a win over Tony Ferguson, the dead body of Tony Ferguson, they better welcome Tony Ferguson into the UFC Hall of Fame with arms wide open, because he deserves that at least. He deserves that. I mean, he's damn near 40 years old. He's riddled with CT. He's on this crazy losing streak. And they're like, you know what? Let's try to build Paddy Pimblett off his name. Instead, forget about Matt Frevola. That fight was far more compelling and would have actually been a quality win for Paddy Pimblett. I just think this is disgusting matchmaking by the UFC. And I know they don't care. They're just, okay, let's build a prospect off a legend. That's what they've done historically. But let me just say this. I do believe that there is a chance that Tony Ferguson wins this fight. And, you know, I think a lot of people are going to act like UFC 296, it's the funeral for Wonderboy Thompson. It's the funeral for Tony Ferguson. If Tony Ferguson beats Paddy Pimblett, if this version, 40-year-old Tony Ferguson on a 6-fight losing streak, beats Paddy Pimblett's career is over. It's done. I don't ever want to hear the words Paddy Pimblett again. Cut him from the organization. So this is a massive risk by the UFC, because losing to this version of Tony Ferguson, I mean, that is a really bad look for Paddy Pimblett, because this is the most favorable matchup the UFC could have gave him with any possible name value. A guy on his way out, a guy who doesn't even belong in the organization anymore. So if Paddy Pimblett loses this, he's done for. He is done. He's a dead body at that point. So this is a big risk, but ultimately for my early prediction, I have to go with Paddy Pimblett, even though he got a robbery win over Jared Gordon. But I do think that Tony Ferguson, even this washed version of Tony Ferguson, I think he could get it done. He looked okay against Bobby Green in the first round at least. But I just don't think, I think Paddy Pimblett has okay wrestling. He has okay power, has an okay chin. Meanwhile, Tony just looks like he's slowing down. Every time out, he looks slower and slower and slower. So I have to go Paddy Pimblett. I'm going to say Paddy Pimblett via decision. I think Tony Ferguson just takes a beating and keeps moving forward. And I don't even think it's going to be that impressive of a win. So even though I think Paddy Pimblett wins, I'm going to say he wins a decision, maybe even loses a round. And I think it'll be a mildly competitive fight. You won't be blown away. It won't look like, oh, Paddy Pimblett made Tony Ferguson look like he didn't even belong in there. I think Tony Ferguson has a chance to win this fight. And he must know this is a must-win, but to be honest, it's a must-win for both guys. But I think Paddy Pimblett is the new PMF. He's not defending the belt against Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson doesn't want that belt. But Paddy Pimblett, disgraceful matchmaking for him. He must have turned down Matt Frevola, and I'm just disgusted with it. But this is the UFC nowadays, and ultimately, I understand why the UFC is doing it. So it is what it is. But yeah, those are my official predictions, or my early predictions, not my official predictions. I have to go Paddy Pimblett. I also think Shavkat Rakhmonov wins. But UFC 296 is looking amazing. And honestly, if Tony Ferguson beats Paddy Pimblett, I will erupt in pure joy. I will absolutely love that if Tony Ferguson pulls it off. And then I would love a retirement in the cage. Please, Tony, if you beat Paddy Pimblett, retire in the cage. Please, please, please. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Who are you picking in both these fights? What do you think of both of these fights? Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.